Fuzzy Mud by Louis Sachar, Chapter 21, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:21 p.m. A dead tree lay on its side, partially propped up by its broken branches. An image flashed into Maya's head of Marshall standing atop a tree that had fallen over. She hurried toward it. Up close, the tree seemed larger than she remembered. There was a thick branch sticking almost straight up from the trunk, with lots of smaller branches coming off it. She doubted it was the same tree. Some of the bark crumbled away as she grabbed the base of the largest branch. She pulled herself up, then looked around, just as Marshall had done. Ahead, the ground sloped steeply down to a gully. Rising up from the other side of the gully were two hills. One of those hills could have been where they'd left Chad. She cupped her hands around her mouth like a megaphone and tried to make her tiny voice project across the vast woodlands. Chad! Her eyes scanned the two hillsides, hoping to see Marshall's rocky ledge, but all she could see were trees and more trees. She hopped down. The ground went splat beneath her left foot. Even before she looked, she realized what she had done. She stared down in horror at her left foot, ankle-deep in fuzzy mud. She tried to step free, but her foot wouldn't budge. The mud held tight. She could feel the warmth oozing through her sock. Her right foot had landed safely just on the edge of the mud puddle. She took a long stride back toward the fallen tree and grabbed one of the small dead branches. Its rough and pointy edges ripped through her blisters as she desperately pulled with all her might. The branch broke at the same moment her foot pulled free. She nearly fell backward into the mud, but managed to force her momentum sideways and landed on the dry, leaf-covered ground. She instantly yanked off her sneaker and then her muddy sock. She now had mud on her fingers, and she wiped them on her sweater and skirt. She took off her sweater and used it as best she could to clean her leg and foot. She pulled the cloth back and forth between her toes and continued to rub even after she didn't see any more of the mud on her. She was more worried about what she couldn't see. She left her muddy sweater on top of the dead tree, lunch sack in hand, one shoe off, one shoe on. She continued down the slope toward the gully. Chad! 2 times 262,144 equals 524,288. 2 times 524,288 equals 1,048,576. Chapter 22, Wednesday, November 3rd, 1:45 p.m. At the beginning of each school year, a parent or guardian of every student at Woodridge Academy is required to fill out a bunch of forms. Among other things, they were to provide the school with their various phone numbers and emergency contact information. Those numbers were now being called grade by grade in alphabetical order. From inside her office, Mrs. Thaxton could hear Mr. Franks and Mrs. Latherley as they made one call after another. There's been an incident. Your child is perfectly safe. We're just taking extra precautions. No, we need you to personally pick up your daughter. Your babysitter's name is not in our files. If you want to fax or email your signed authorization. No decision has been made yet about tomorrow. We will be sending out a mass email. Mrs. Thaxton knew she should have been making the calls too, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had just gotten off the phone with Tamea's mother, who had telephoned the school after receiving Mrs. Latherley's message. No, she had not picked Tamea up after lunch. Yes, she knew about the rash and was planning to take Tamea to the doctor, but not until after school. What's this all about? Where's Tamea? Mrs. Dilwadi was on her way home now. Their best hope was that Tamea had decided to go home after lunch without telling anyone, but they also knew Tamea wouldn't have done that. Mrs. Thaxton's chin trembled, and her eyes were blurry with tears. She blamed herself for not putting the school on lockdown the moment she'd heard that Chad Hillegas was missing. She could have done it right then. Better to overreact than underreact. But she knew the type of boy Chad was. Whatever had happened to him, wherever he was, she hadn't thought it had anything to do with the rest of the school. Not that she hadn't been concerned about him. She had been very concerned. She just hadn't taken his disappearance as a danger sign for the other students. She remembered when Chad and his mother first came to her office. Her mother wrote out a check for the tuition, handed it to her, and then, right in front of Chad, declared, "He's your problem now." Timea was different. She was the exact opposite of Chad. She was respectful of her teachers and considerate of others. She followed the rules. She was the type of student a teacher might easily ignore, and that, Mrs. Thaxton now realized, might be why she had gone missing without anyone noticing. Mrs. Thaxton shut her eyes very tight. She knew she needed to be strong in this time of crisis. 2 missing children in 2 days. She did not yet know that a 3rd child would also be discovered missing. She assumed Marshall was safely back in class. Mr. Davison assumed he was still with the headmistress. No one was worried about poor Marshall. Chapter 23. The ground was mostly soft under Timea's cold bare foot, but she had to step carefully to avoid the sticks and sharp rocks buried beneath the fallen leaves. Her rash had spread the full length of her arm, and she could see small red bumps on her other hand now too. She tingled all over, although she couldn't be sure if that was caused by the mud or by her own heebie-jeebies. It seemed wherever she looked there were more mud puddles. Yet, as bad as it was for her, she knew it had to be 10 times worse for Chad. At least she'd been able to go home yesterday. She'd been able to take a bath and change her clothes. "Chad!" she started to shout, then gasped and brought her hand almost to her mouth. Just ahead lay some kind of dead animal, half covered in muck and fuzz. She quickly turned her head away. It could have been a raccoon or possibly a small dog. The mud made it hard to know, and she didn't want to look. She made a wide circle around it, carefully watching every step before gently setting her foot down. She wondered if there was anybody else, anywhere, who knew about the fuzzy mud. She had tried to tell Mrs. Latherley, but the school nurse had been more worried about peanut butter. Even Marshall hadn't seemed to get it. Was it possible that she was the only one in the whole world who knew? The thought scared her, but it was also what made her keep going. If not her, who? She was determined to make it to the hills on the other side of the gully. "Chad!" she shouted. "Are you out here?" As the slope of the hill became steeper, she needed to grab onto branches to keep from losing her balance. She bounced from tree to tree, down toward the gully. There were fewer trees close to the gully, and the ground became even steeper. Timea could see down directly into the gully. It was more than half filled with fuzzy mud. She eased herself into a sitting position and rolled up the top of her lunch sack so nothing would spill. She slid down toward the mud, using her sneakered foot as a brake to keep from going too fast. The ground was too steep, and she started to turn sideways. She pulled out a clump of weeds to steady herself, but the weeds ripped out of the ground, and she flipped over onto her stomach. Her knees scraped across jagged rocks. Then her foot slammed into a large boulder, finally stopping her. She clutched another clump of weeds to try to hold herself in place as she carefully moved her other foot to the boulder for more support. Looking over her shoulder, she saw that she was only a few feet from the edge of the gully. A thin layer of fuzzy mud, of fuzzy scum, rose up from it like smoke. Not too far away, she could see the flat top of a rock embedded in the dirt. It would make a good jump-off spot. It looked to be about a 6-foot jump from one side of the gully to the other. She moved, crab-like, along the slope toward the flat-top rock. She dug her fingernails into the dirt to keep from slipping. She knew she'd have to move quickly. If she hesitated for even a second, she could end up in the mud. She pushed herself up, spun around, and slammed her sneaker foot down on the rock. She jumped and hit the other side, only inches above the mud. Using her momentum, she scrambled upward, away from the gully. It wasn't until she was walking away, following a dry creek bed, that she noticed the pain from all the bruises on her hands, arms, knees, and legs. Her skirt had rolled up a bit during her slide, and she had scratches and scrapes on her stomach as well. Still, she knew her pain was nothing compared to Chad's. "Chad!" The creek bed wound its way upward between the two hills she had seen from the other side of the gully. She kept looking from one hill to the other, hoping to see Marshall's rocky ledge, although she knew that even if she found it, that didn't mean Chad was still nearby. "Chad!" Her throat was dry, and her weak voice had gotten even weaker. For a second she thought she'd heard something. She stopped and listened. The woods were silent. Looking back the way she had come, she wondered if she'd ever find her way out of there. She didn't want to have to cross the gully again. She heard a noise. Twigs were breaking. Then footsteps. The steps were uneven, like someone was stomping and staggering. Then she saw him. He crashed his way through a tangle of twigs and thin branches. She froze. "I'm here!" he called, but his voice was a little more than a raspy whisper. He took several deep, uneven breaths, then continued to push his way toward her. "I'm here!" he repeated weakly. His face was a mass of blisters crusted with pus and dried blood, and so badly swollen she could hardly see his eyes. She started to bring her hands to her mouth, then stopped herself, not wanting to get the rash on her lips or tongue. He came closer. "Where'd you go?" he called from only a few feet away. He sank to his knees. "I'm right here," he whimpered. "Where'd you go?" She felt overwhelmed with feelings of horror, revulsion, and pity. When she spoke softly. "Are you hungry?" 2 times 1,048,576 equals 2,097,152. 2 times 2,097,152 equals 4,194,304.